So by 1850, Illinois has, census again, 3,693 people from the state of Maine. Wisconsin has 3,252 people from the state of Maine. Michigan has 1,117, and among those are going to be not only the Washburn brothers, but a lot of their friends. So what happens to my Washburn brothers, first of all, is that the youngest of the ones I told you about, Cadwallader Colden, known as Cad, is the first to go west, and he goes to Illinois first. He's going to move in just a minute. And then he starts to move around, and when he goes to Illinois, and then he's going to figure he can't make enough money in Illinois, so he moves up to Wisconsin. And when he moves to Wisconsin, he moves to a town that is surrounded by people he knew in Livermore. There are people he actually knows there. Now, I'm not going to tell you more about Cadwallader unless you really care deeply about him, as I suspect many of you do. But he is actually going to go on to start Gold Medal Flour. And there's also another Washburn I'm not going to tell you about. But Cad ends up being incredibly important later on in life. I'm not going to tell you about that now. He's the first one out there, and then Sid is the next one to move. Sid becomes a banker in Boston, and I can't really tell you more about Sid unless you'd like to know more about him. But then Elihu moves west, and he moves west to see Cad, and from meeting up with Cad in Illinois before Cad moves to Wisconsin, Elihu moves to Illinois. And in Illinois, he moves to the most booming, growing area at the time. He moves to Galena. Does anybody else know who lives in Galena? U.S. Grant. And if anybody is keeping score, Eli Parker, who is the Seneca, who's going to go ahead and be one of the only generals in the Civil War, indigenous generals in the Civil War. There's one on the Union, and there's one on the Confederate side. It's Stan Waddy on the Confederate side. Eli Parker is at the time an engineer for the U.S. government, and he gets sent to Galena to redo the Treasury building there. And that's how he gets to know Grant. And when the war breaks out, he wants to be a soldier, and because he's indigenous, they won't take him. And so Grant says, he's a friend of mine, put him on my staff. And that's how the U.S. ends up with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, when the Confederacy does not use its engineers for anything other than digging graves, and why all of their forts end up underwater. All right, so I've gotten these people out west for you now, and everybody's going to be happy, and it's all over, right? Of course not. What happens once they move out west is that these young men from Maine, now who live in Illinois and Wisconsin are the two I gave you, but there's going to be other states involved, want to develop their region. And they want to go ahead and clean up the rivers and harbors of the Great Lakes, especially where there are ships being lost all the time. And they go ahead and they get in front of Congress a bill to go ahead and improve the rivers and harbors so people stop dying. Same thing, by the way, that Abraham Lincoln is going to care about when his town goes to the Sangamon River. And they think it's going to, and Southern Democrats say no and invest in internal improvements. Great Lakes, what we care about is the continuation of our system of enslavement, and we do not want to have the federal government messing around in the economy, because we can see pretty clearly that we will be next. By 1850, Israel Washburn had had enough of this, and he gets elected to Congress on the promise that he will stand against the slave power. Very early for that kind of a declaration, which normally is going to come in about 1855. He's saying it in 1850, and that means he becomes a Congress critter from Maine and goes to Congress from Maine. 2 years later, Elihu gets elected from Illinois. So now we have Israel in Congress from Maine, Elihu in Congress from Illinois. Cadwallader is not yet in Congress, but he's shortly going to be, and I couldn't resist writing down this quotation. Somebody wrote to Israel, he said, "Can you help us? The Washburns, being at least a quorum of the House, of course can carry anything. The executive, judiciary, Senate, and Washburns constitute the government. Read or show this to the other 50 or 60 of your brothers. Call a caucus call a caucus of the Washburns and see if the measure can't pass. But when they go into Congress in the 1850s, Israel warns about oligarchy. He says, in the same kind of terms that other people, including Abraham Lincoln, are going to be using very shortly, he worries, quote, that the money power will be too much centralized, that the lands and property of the country may come to be held or controlled by a comparatively small number of people. That's 1852, he says that. And in 1854, of course, we get the culmination of that fire bell in the night with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1954. Trivia point here, that's my favorite law in American history. I know you all have them too. The Kansas-Nebraska Act is the act that Stephen Douglas gets forced through Congress that repeals the Missouri Compromise. It says that, in fact, the South can take its enslaved people, white enslavers can take their, what they consider their property into the land that had been left free under the Missouri Compromise in the Louisiana Purchase. So all those lands above the southern, the line along the southern border of Missouri, above that, are supposed to be free under the Missouri Compromise, and everything below that had already been claimed by the South. But with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, all that land was suddenly now going to be open to enslavement. Not only is that a problem if you're against slavery, it's a problem because if all those lands become slave states, the slave states will overawe the free states in Congress, both in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, and they have already said that they are going to make human enslavement national. So here you've got all these men who had watched their state be tied to Missouri in order for them to get their statehood, and all of a sudden that law just ended up in the trash. So what happens? On May 9th, 1854, Israel Washburn calls a meeting in Washington of about 30 other congressmen. And these congressmen are know-nothings, and they're Democrats, and they're Whigs, and they're Free Soilers, and they're a whole conglomerate of different people. But he calls a meeting of about 30 of them, along with his brother Elihu, and they meet in the rooms at Mrs. Crutchett's boarding house of Thomas Eliot and Edward Dickinson, both congressmen from Massachusetts. And you know Edward Dickinson because he had a daughter who wrote poetry. And she was not yet a recluse. She did actually visit her father in Washington while he was there. I love the 19th century. There's only 6 people in it, and they do the rest with mirrors. But what they did is, in May of that year, they came together and they said, we must stop the spread of enslavement. We must stop the rise of this oligarchy that's taking over our government. We have a lot of differences amongst ourselves, but we know American democracy, and we think we should start a new political party. And that new political party, well, I guess we need a name. Maybe we should call it the Republican Party. This matters not only because this is the first beating heart of the Republican Party, but because of who did it. Because they had connections all over the North. And they had friends that they had grown up with in the middle part of Maine and in New Hampshire and in Vermont. Vermont also has a lot of people who move west. And they meet in May because then they can go back to, in the summer, back home to their home states and gin up all kinds of enthusiasm for this new party. And that is exactly what they do. By 1856, Owen Lovejoy is elected to Congress from Illinois. He's Elijah P. Lovejoy's brother. He grew up one town away from the Washburns. John Potter is going to be a congressman from Wisconsin. Abraham Lincoln, of course, is going to tap Hannibal Hamlin to be his vice president in recognition of the power of the state of Maine in this moment. Timothy Howe is going to go into the Senate from Wisconsin in 1861. Timothy Howe was the Washburns school teacher in Livermore. During the Civil War, Maine had governors of 6 states other than the state of Maine. So I wanted to tell you this story at this moment in this space because of what it means to have this kind of a civic organization. I was not, for all you might have heard otherwise, except for that B, a good student. And I learned about these men because of organizations like this one. And I found it absolutely fascinating to be up there in that space and to learn about these really ordinary men who took on this giant project and managed to come from their country towns and go ahead and to stand on principle and to go ahead and change the world. So I would like to offer the Arts and Cultural Alliance of Freeport my deepest congratulations on this new part of your journey. And I wish and I hope for you that you may lead the way in changing the world. Thank you. Time to talk about stuff if you would like to ask questions or throw things open. That was obviously much more historical than you were probably expecting from me, but how could I not? Yes, there is a microphone, by the way, I think.
Well, I don't think I need one. I'm Joe Wishkepper. Thank you very much. Question that occurred to me when you were talking is Hannibal Hamlin. Why was he not chosen by Lincoln?
Oh, you don't want to ask that question because I know the answer to that. This is actually a great story. I did all kinds of research on this and then I got bored with it, so I never wrote it up. Someday I might. It's a great story and it's a little bit long, but this is like the 3rd time I've told it. Okay, so Hannibal Hamlin doesn't do much during the first term. He is put on the ticket because he's from Maine. And because Maine is on the verge between Republicans and Democrats, and Lincoln knows that if he can get Maine behind it, Maine actually elects its state officers earlier than any other state. So if you can get, as Maine goes, so goes the nation, right? You want Maine behind you. So he puts Hannibal Hamlin on the ticket, but Hamlin doesn't do very much. And so he's kind of expendable, you know. They're kind of, like there's never, who could even imagine there would be an assassination or something? So no one really cares who the vice president is. So if you remember your history of Lincoln, there were a number of more radical thinkers associated with the Lincoln presidency who thought Lincoln was far too conservative, and they were led by Salmon P. Chase, and if you ever want to hear stories, I have Salmon P. Chase stories. Ask me why he's on the $100,000 bill. But Salmon P. Chase wanted to be president more than anything in 1864, and basically he sells his daughter to make that happen to this cotton. Actually, this is being recorded. Never mind. Salmon P. Chase wanted to be president, and so he comes up with this way. He's very concerned about Lincoln's Secretary of State, who is William Henry Seward. He believes Seward is the conservative influence that is ruining the Lincoln presidency. And he wants to get rid of Seward because if he can knock Seward out before 64, he thinks he's going to get the nomination to the presidency. Lincoln is so smart and he's such an operator. So you have to know this piece. There was a tradition in the 19th century that you could not have a member of the cabinet or the president or the vice president from the same state. Seward's from New York. So what the Chase people do is they go ahead and they say, they start this boom for this New Yorker. And they say he's a New York Democrat, he's put up with so much during this war, we really, we need to do something to reward him. We should absolutely give him the vice presidency, because if he becomes vice president, Seward's going to have to resign. The problem with that is that Seward is the protege of Thurlow Weed. Now, Thurlow Weed is like the mover and shaker in New York. He's the wire puller in New York, and he really runs New York. New York has more electoral votes than anybody else in the country. So and Thurlow Weed's already mad about the Homestead Act, so he is teetering. He hasn't said he's going to support Lincoln in '64, and if Lincoln gets rid of Seward, that's it. He's going to lose Thurlow Weed. And that really matters not only because Thurlow Weed is a wire puller, but because Thurlow Weed's other protege owns and runs the New York Times. And Lincoln doesn't have a newspaper in New York. So Lincoln, in his typical Lincoln way, goes, "You're right. We have not done enough for war Democrats. They have suffered so terribly. We really must help out those people who've sacrificed so much for us. And who has sacrificed more than Andrew Johnson of Tennessee?" Which is absolutely true. I mean, he stayed with the Union when his state left and all that. And of course, he outfoxed them. That's exactly who ends up on the ticket, in part because they literally at the convention, they let Tennessee vote for a president and vice president, even though they're really not part of the Union. And they box in the New Yorkers, literally physically, so that they can't protest. Their physical stuff matters a lot in those days. So Johnson is on the ticket really just to keep Thurlow Weed on the ticket so Lincoln can keep the New York Times on the ticket. And Lincoln does not expect he's going to be assassinated. It's never happened. And there you go. Nobody's ever really asked about that story before, but that, I will promise you, is the correct story. And you can see why I've never written a book about it, because I lost you all about the time I got to Thurlow Weed. But yes, I've read the Thurlow Weed papers because I had to know what he was up to. Other questions?
Want to tell you, it's just what a wonderful talk. And although Livermore may be close to Augusta, it's also very close to my hometown of Farmington. And I can't tell you, my family is very close friends with Billy Gammon. So thank you so
that's
much
so nice.
For talking about the North. That's why I kind of, when you said something about Billy Gammon, the New Orleans. And when we used to drive from Farmington down to Lewiston, we always took the New Orleans Road. And I think mostly because my dad, it would give my excuse of my dad to tell stories about the Washburn brothers, because he loved telling the history, all the stories about the various Washburn brothers. So thank you so much.
Well, someday I would love to write a book about them. I always told Billy I would, because I didn't mention Sid, because one of the things that's so interesting about this whole movement west is money. Like, who's got the money? And what they did when they had this many kids is, and Sid is the one that happens in that family, they send him to a city, and he bankrolls the other guys. And so Sid doesn't go into Congress, and most people haven't heard. There's also a fourth brother who's born later who also goes into the Senate from Minnesota. That's William Drew Washburn. And he is the guy that Ignatius Donnelly writes Caesar's column about. Ignatius Donnelly is the guy who writes the preamble to the Populist Party platform in 1892 that's so famous about how, they all suck, we should kill them all. And then when he loses to William Drew Washburn in that election, he writes Caesar's column, which is this apocalyptic novel in which the column is made out of the skulls of his enemies. So it's a book waiting to happen, and that's just the boys. You should hear about the girls.
So you really So look forward to reading that book. But I'm sure, like everybody else here and millions of others, I wake up I'm an early riser anyway, but I think you go to sleep about the
I
time
believe I write to you not infrequently at 11 o'clock going, what the hell does this number mean? Somebody died.
Anyway, so like a lot of people, millions of people, I wake up and you're the first thing I read, and it's just been such a blessing the last 2 years, September?
I started on September 15th. It's been 2 years and some and change.
Wow. So anyway, it's just been wonderful. So,
it's such a great community we've built, though.
But
it's not just me. I just write it down.
It's amazing to me how you can write those. every day, but except Sunday mornings, you usually have a picture from buddies.
I confess I might post a picture tonight because I have to drive back to Boston and I don't expect to get there, but we'll see.
Human, that's nice.
Otherwise, I'm going to write about voting tonight.
So, Chris, it's very disturbing what you're writing about, what's going on in our own country. So I don't know what a good segue is between the 1800s and this, but any thoughts about where we're heading in terms of, sometimes I read you and I think, oh my goodness, we're just heading for another civil war. And then other times I feel a bit more optimistic and I feel like a ping pong ball. I'm just going back and forth, every day or every week, and it's hard to know where this is all going to end. So I just wonder if you could use your historical perspective and give us some vision, some kind of crystal ball.
So that's not just you that's going back and forth. The media is doing that too. So if you're feeling like that, I am very aware of it, to the point that I'll sit there and say, well, yesterday was a bad day, today's going to be a good day. And that's exactly what happens. And there's some reasons for that. I am extremely concerned about where this country is. If we don't get a Voting Rights Act, I just can't even finish that. I expect we will look like Hungary, or at best, frankly. And this is one of the reasons so many historians are becoming active, is because we know how this goes. We have seen this, and it's happened in America before. This is precisely, that is, the loss of democracy and the concentration of power in the hands of a small group of people, not always economically wealthy people or people at the top of the social scale, but if you think of the American South between about 1874 and 1964, you didn't have democracy. You had a one-party state. And the thing that people like me try and point out is that was oppressive, obviously, to Black Americans and immigrant Americans. Sometimes we forget about the fact that Italians were also lynched in the American South, and indigenous Americans, but also any white American who was not related to the right people. You certainly have heard people talking about how they were told to get out of town before the sun went down. There are sundown towns for Black people, but the same was true in the South. There was not equal justice before the law. Some people's kids got off, some people's kids didn't. There was not economic investment, because you can't invest in an area when the laws aren't equal, because you're at the mercy of a tweet. And so historians like me, and not just me, some of the other ones who are as active as we are on social media and all that, are really trying to say, the good version of what we're talking about is the American South. The bad version you know of, and there are signs right now of both of those things, including one of the things I watch very closely is language. And when people start to talk about their opponents as baby killers or as vermin, you're in real trouble. Or as like oceans, as waves. And Donald Trump Jr. was beginning to do that in the Trump administration, was beginning to do that by 2017. And Carly Fiorina did it in a debate, in the presidential debate leading up to 2016. And I went ballistic at that point because of the way she was talking in that. And I'm like, that's Nazi talk. That is literally Nazi talk. That's out there. But that's the bad side, and I strongly urge you all to demand, write, call, take over social media for a Voting Rights Act, which is literally just asking to level the playing field and to claw back some of the imbalance that has been written into our system since 1986, is when the idea of voter suppression really took off in the wake of the Motor Voter Act of 1993. The other side of this is that, and we do argue about this, a lot of us, at length, is that what does it look like? What would that look like? The percentage of people who do not support the current concentration of wealth in America, and I'm not talking about political parties, I'm talking about that alone, is extraordinarily high. How do you put that down? Our generation might not see it, but the next generation doesn't even speak that same language. So the long term looks good, but also the short term, if we fix that voting rights piece, there's an issue here that this is not uncommon. This happens with two-party systems, where if you have two things to win, you can either get more voters by broadening your appeal, or you can get rid of your opponent's voters. And democracy advocates will always tell you you want to broaden your base, not because you're generous or anything, but because if you start to cut away the other side, that forces you to extremes. And the same thing happened in the 1850s with the Democratic Party does this. They kill off their moderates, and they end up being so extreme, they can't even keep their own party together. And of course, they fall apart, they splinter, and I could tell you the history of the Democrats, but they go off the deep end. And that's exactly what's happened to the Republican Party now. They're eating their own. And it's just heartbreaking for somebody like me to watch. So where do I think this is going? I have said forever we're on a knife edge, and it's going to have to be resolved. And I'll stop writing when it does. And I told everybody I'd stop writing immediately after the election because that was going to be the answer. And here we still are. I think this election of 2022 is a make or break election. I don't know if you saw today, but Trump, former President Trump's spokesperson has said the first thing on his agenda if he is reelected in 2024. Mind you, I'm not convinced he's going to run. That's a different story. But he and his people want to put through voting reform, which, but then they said, we're not really sure we'll have to because the states are already doing it. We've had 19 states pass 33 laws that have dramatically cut down on voting. And that's exactly what the South did after the Civil War. I wish I could be more hopeful. I promise you, I don't stay up till 3 o'clock in the morning for fun. But I do feel like, we did this before. And we've done it a couple of times before in America, and we haven't failed yet. Yes?
So how do we influence Susan Collins? I imagine all of us have been on the phone repeatedly with her, sending, not with her, but, sending letters and all that. I mean, it just seems that she is just, Republican solid all the way and could care less about what leaders think. So any thoughts on
I have no thoughts on anybody in particular. I am an idealist when it comes in terms of the work I do. That doesn't mean I hunt ducks with a rake. It means that I believe that what changes society is ideas. And what changes ideas is public discourse. So what I always say to people is speak up everywhere. And you see this really dramatically, of course, with the fact that Alex Jones has named his organization InfoWars. Like, we're going to put out the wrong kind of information to more people. And you also saw it with a recent vote in which an organization affiliated with the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, flooded West Virginia and Joe Manchin's office with protesters. They weren't from West Virginia, but they wanted him to think they were from West Virginia, and there was a secret tape of it. So all I can say is, I don't know Susan Collins. I don't know what would move her. But the idea of our system is that the people who are in Washington represent us. And the more that they hear that us is not happy, the more shot we have, perhaps not of changing any specific individual, but of changing somebody else. I know there is strong movement in favor of this Voting Rights Act. I'm not at all sure that people are calling it right. Remember, Kirsten Sinema is a co-signer of it, co-sponsor of it, and Joe Manchin wrote the thing. So I don't think we know the answer to that. The answer, of course, on that's the filibuster. There's a place you can put pressure is on the filibuster for a carve out. I mean, I don't think you're going to get the loss of the filibuster, which annoys me to no end because it's just completely ahistorical, But a carve-out is begging to happen, as we've had carve-outs now for two other categories. Wanted to have a carve-out for voting rights. Tom.
Tom, I like that courageous group of 30 people who broke away and formed a party. Do you believe that there's potential of that today? And if so, who do you think might be the leaders who have the guts to stand up?
So there's a difference now. The question was, what about a new party? And the problem with that nowadays is that the machinery of the Republican and the Democratic parties are so very deeply ingrained in this country, not only structurally, they're certainly structurally there, huge amounts of money, but also in terms of loyalties. We're not at a period, at least in our generation here, maybe younger people are more malleable. It's very hard to start a third party. And what third parties tend to do is they drain blood away from the main parties, which sometimes we cheer on and sometimes we don't cheer on. But there was a move, I forget what day of the week it is, but what is today? It's Friday? So there was a move, Sunday. Major move on the part of a couple very well-regarded conservatives who have left the Republican Party and who came out, as the Lincoln Project did, and said, no third party, vote Democrat, because we need to stop this now. And I don't know if you saw it, but that happened today in, anybody remind me, I read it quickly. Was it one of the countries that has fallen under, has lost its democracy, reclaimed it by everybody joining together to throw out the dictator in charge. And I'm drawing a blank. Was it the Czech Republic? Yeah. So I think that's exactly what they're looking for, is to go ahead and do that. And then we can splinter again, which is precisely what Lincoln and his people did. They pulled everybody together and said, we got to stand against the Democrats. And then we'll go ahead and we'll splinter again. But that's what they thought in '55 when they really organized after the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But they didn't do that. And one of the reasons that I always say that we're not really going to get extra parties, although the Maine's ranked choice voting is really interesting for that. I don't know if you watch Lisa Murkowski at all, but Alaska also has ranked choice voting, and that enables her to be very independent of the party, which is fun to watch. What the Republicans did after they said we all got to just, and Lincoln has that great quote where he says we got to, everybody picks up a hoe or a shovel or whatever, and we fight back on our own terms, and then we'll figure it all out later. Is he doesn't expect, certainly when he says that, and nobody expects of him to go ahead and articulate a new set of values for a political party, because the concept of political parties is really quite new. We really only get the concept of organized political parties in America in about 1830. So and the Whigs never really managed to pull that off in any meaningful way. So when the Republicans form, they're really not thinking about a party. And in 1858, a really horrible man, a South Carolina senator named James Henry Hammond, who's infamous for raping not only his slaves, both male and female, but his nieces. And then he put it in his diary, that's how we know. And he thought that he should be rather congratulated for not doing worse because they were so cute as little girls. He gives a speech in Congress, which you all know is the Cotton is King speech, but it's really a speech that talks about how Southern elites have figured out the world. That the founders got it wrong when they talked about all men being created equal, because that was ridiculous. Of course all men weren't created equal. And that the Southerners had figured out how to excise that from our government and create a real government, which is a hierarchy in which the really spectacular people like him were on top, and everybody else were the mudsills, the pieces of the building that were driven into the mud to hold the greater edifice above. And he gives this speech. It's quite a long speech, although you can, if anybody cares, I can tell you where you can find it. You can now get it on Google Books. And it's awful. And he says that once you're born to be a mudsill, you should stay as a mudsill. And Abraham Lincoln listens to this, and Lincoln is brilliant. He's a brilliant man. And he's just a brilliant man. And he, of course, began as a mudsill. Had a terribly poor upbringing, which is sort of interesting. But at one point when this family is living in Indiana before they moved to Illinois, they literally spend the winter in a 3-sided hut with a fire on the 4th side. And the idea that he should be a mudsill for the rest of his life is just vile to him. So in 1859, he takes that opportunity to stand up at the Milwaukee Agricultural Fair to a bunch of farmers and say, that's not how the world works. The way the world works is not what James Henry Hammond says, that we have a hierarchy and that the government should support the people at the top who take all the labor that the mudsills are creating, and they think great thoughts, and they build libraries, and they travel to Europe, and they buy paintings. The way the world really should work is that government should support the men on the make. the guys who are working hard because they innovate and they're hungry and they think of new ways to do things and they change and they grow and the society will grow, as it doesn't when it's just the James Henry Hammonds on top of things. And when he did that, when he articulated the idea that the government should help people at the bottom and they would produce more than they could consume and they would then help the next tier of people and they would help a few people at the very top, a few financiers, a few industrialists who would hire the people at the bottom, and you would have kind of, as one of my students said, a pyramid scheme in which the country always improved. The Chicago Tribune actually said, so long as we have labor in this world, so long as we have, until every beggar shall have a coach and four, we shall never be out of labor in this world. They believed that a rising tide would lift all boats, right? That ideology, I think, got ingrained into America and is as important to who we are as the democratic ideology, which is very different, but also equally important. And I keep saying to people that if the Republican Party died tomorrow, which I don't think it will because I say of all this apparatus, although the fact that Trump packed all of the state offices with his own people is hurting the state organizations badly. I think that the ideology of the Republican Party would reform itself under a new party within 2 weeks, because that is so deeply ingrained in our psyches, our literature, our understanding of the world. And I would argue it's important for who we are. So I don't really see a third party, but I'm a prophet of the past, not the future.
Really despicable people like Alex Jones and InfoWars and other stuff like QAnon, I feel like disinformation has kind of been a big theme that's come up over the past couple of years as we've seen all of this kind of chaos develop. And it seems, partly to me, that so much of how it's spreading these days is unique to the technology that we have today. But I'm wondering if there are lessons from the past that we can take about how to kind of combat that might still be kind of relevant to helping today.
Yes, although the question is disinformation nowadays, and what's different nowadays is the internet. And that, as I always tell my students, is as revolutionary as fire. It's changed everything. It's changed how we interact. It's changed our understanding of other countries. So what the internet has, and it's kind of like the Wild West now. I do think we're going to get a handle on it. Everybody's like, oh, this is it, we're all over. I don't think we're all over. We've reacted crazily to every kind of new technology we've gotten. There's always this period where people do crazy things with it and make all kinds of mistakes with it, and then we figure it out, and then we regulate it, and then we're fine. And you can see, especially with the Facebook whistleblower now being in the news as much as she is, there's already afoot an argument which has actually been out there for a while. America's got the issue of the First Amendment, so you can't regulate what's said on the internet, but you can regulate the algorithms that are currently privileging. Not only Alex Jones is out there, but the one that interests me is Dan Bongino, who is on Facebook, and he is a disinformation guy, but he doesn't actually produce very much. He is retweeted at great length by bots. And so if you look at the lists of the most retweeted people on Facebook every day, Dan Bongino is the top 9 almost always. And he doesn't have anything really new. He's being retweeted by bots. They're not real people. You get rid of the bots, you get rid of the algorithms that privilege inflammatory speech, you're going to go a long way to taking care of that problem to begin with. But it's interesting you say that, because one of the reasons I think that the letters have become as popular as they have is because they say they're not about me, and they're quite long. Can I just say they're quite long? And every time I'm like, oh, because I try never to go over 1,200 words, and which is a lot. Usually a newspaper article is a maximum of 8. And everyone's like, why don't you write more? It's like, because I'm going to have to die over here. But I think that people are not reacting to the letters, although there's good information in them. They're good. I work very hard on them. But when I started putting them up on Facebook, I actually hired a moderator to go ahead and cut out all the crap. And it took, he works pretty much full time. And what's that has done is it has returned the sense of a public space that is safe, where people are comfortable. And now they police themselves, which is great, but we are constantly under attack. And it is absolutely possible to weed those people out, because you can see, they're not people. You can see exactly what they are. And they've tried everything from, first it was the usual, the MAGA young men, and then we zapped all them. And then it was old ladies pretending to be MAGA people. Then it was men hitting on the women. Then it was women hitting on the men or the women. And just last week I guess it was, I do these Facebook talks, it was live porn. And people reported it immediately. And can I just say, doing this is nothing compared to doing a Facebook talk with live porn beside you. Because I was like, okay, I've talked through fist fights, I've talked sick, but I'm like, I can't do this. And I thought, no, because then they'll win. And I finished it because I wasn't going to let them win. They could stop that. That's just a question of holding their feet to the fire. And when people reported that, they said live sex acts are not considered offensive by Facebook. And I'm like, oh, come on, So I do think there's a solution. I do think disinformation is the answer, and I do think that people are unduly cowed by what they think is this sea of opposition to what they believe, when in fact it's a sea of bots that are retweeting things. And that's why I say push back, because there aren't that many of them. And the fact that I figured out all we had to do was zap them to create a safe space. And frankly, if you go on Facebook pages of public figures, especially lawmakers, they do not do that. And they're not places people feel comfortable hanging out. You don't want to go look at what your senator is doing and see that kind of crap. Selling people stuff. And anyway, so I do think there's an answer. And I don't think we're that far from it, frankly. It's just about 5 years too late. Cambridge Analytica. Did you see the study? Not Cambridge Analytica, which has been reorganized, but within the last week, there's been a study that they could micro-target one person out of something like 15,000. And all these things about, like, what dog are you like? And, somebody finally put on Twitter, I'm tired, can you just tell me what your passwords are? But don't do those games are like, what beetle are you like? They can micro-target. You know how that works, right? They're selling you. They're not selling you stuff. They're selling you to a buyer. Yeah.
We are all inundated with requests for political donations and so forth. If the single most important issue is saving our democracy, where should we spend our money?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure I can give you a definitive answer on that. I don't feel equipped to give you a good answer on that. I know because I'm sort of in the thinking side of it, and not the electoral side of it. But does anybody want to answer some of those questions? I mean, obviously obviously one can give to fair fight. Voting rights is my big thing. Whenever people ask me what they can do for me is voting rights. But I don't know who needs money. I mean, obviously everybody needs money, but I don't know where that real pressure is right now. But to me, it all comes down to voting rights. If people have a right to vote, they're not inundated with crap from bots, I believe that people will make good decisions. I also, by the way, am a huge believer in public education, which is this whole CRT thing and the whole anti-mask thing in the schools. That is absolutely about destroying our public schools. It is not about critical race theory, and it is not about masks. It's about pulling people out of the schools and making their money follow them into religious schools and private schools. And there's a long history behind that, and it's a real problem. Are you allowed to speak now? I know.
I'm an attorney, I'm not the only one in the room here. And so my
courts, about the Supreme Court. When you start out studying law, you learn about this kind of universal justice. It's what we learn as we learn about the nation too. The courts being the third branch of the government. But today we're seeing a lot of decisions coming out, especially out of the Supreme Court,
At night.
that are political, arguably political in nature, arguably. But maybe history gives us some context on that. As I would like to say, is it different? Is it worse than it's been? Is there hope that the courts ultimately follow the people?
So there's 3 big points. First of all, this is, I believe, the only court in American Supreme Court in American history that doesn't have an elected official on it. The Constitution makes no requirement that there be that the people on the court be lawyers or anything. And traditionally, there have always been elected officials on the court. And I think Sandra Day O'Connor was the last one. And that matters because they pay much more attention to the way society works. So that's one thing I think that matters. Has this ever happened before? Anybody ever heard of Melville Fuller? I hate to tell you this, but he's from Maine. You don't know about him because we know of his court as the Lochner Court, the Lochner era court. And yes, the Melville Fuller was, looked a lot like Mark Twain actually. And he was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, I want to say off the top of my head, 1894 through about maybe 1893, through probably, I don't know, somebody could check this, 1917 or so, maybe a little bit further on. That's Plessy. That's Pollock v. Farmers Loan. That's In re Debs. That's the insular cases. That's Lochner. That's all those cases that say that the big business gets everything and everybody else gets nothing. Every single one of those cases has been overturned or changed by legislation, except the insular cases, which are the ones that give us the concept of basically our holdings, our what are they called? I can think it's protectorates. Puerto Rico, Guam, territories, and the people who live on them being non-citizen nationals. And the idea, it's non-something territories. Come on, I always do this. Non-incorporated territories. And in the non-incorporated, in that legal case, the Supreme Court says that they are, what is it, in America but not of it, or of America, or no, they are foreign in a domestic sense. So this always makes me think of John Roberts, because John Roberts' big thing, of course, is to get rid of voting rights, but he's always been about that. But nobody even remembers who Melville Fuller is. And Chief Justices care a lot about their legacy, so you can see him kind of backing off from where he is. Now, so all that being said, yes, we had the Melville Fuller Court. Yes, it pulled all kind of crap. Yes, it all got overturned. But what's different now is what this Supreme Court is doing is changing what happened after World War II, when under Eisenhower, he realized there was a problem with the liberal consensus that FDR had constructed that used the federal government to help largely white men, workers, black men too to some degree. But FDR didn't dare really to address civil rights because he needed to keep his Democratic coalition together, which meant he needed the Southern Democrats. And so Eisenhower gets in, Truman does a little bit too, but when Truman tries to desegregate the military installations, we get the Strom Thurmond and the Dixiecrats organizing for a very few years, but it was enough to put the fear of God into Truman. So Eisenhower gets in there, and Eisenhower, of course, has the legacy of Lincoln behind him, and Eisenhower's a brilliant man. I hate that he's sort of become known as Elmer Fudd, and it was his own party who did that, because he's brilliant. And so he, of course, puts Earl Warren on the Supreme Court. And that thing about how he didn't know that Earl Warren was going to do Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 is ridiculous. Warren had been in the California judicial system during the Lemon Grove case, which was basically Brown versus Board, but for Mexican American children in California. He couldn't have missed it. He had to know. Warren for anyway. So what happens, though, is that Warren and the Warren Court, and by the way, the Brown versus Board of Education is a unanimous decision, which is important, because what Warren does with that under a system that Thurgood Marshall didn't pioneer but really used to extraordinary effect is use the 14th Amendment, which is the one that increases the power of the federal government. It's the 13th is the first one to increase the power, the 14th is the second, the 15th is the third. And he reaches through the due process clause and the equal, and he reaches back to the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, which cramp the power of the federal government to squish individuals. So it means the federal government can't take away your right of speech, or your right to petition the government, or your right to the free press. And he reaches through the 14th and applies those concepts to the states. And first the Warren Court, and then the Warren Burger Court. Warren Burger is going to be nominated by Nixon. He's also a Republican. They use that to not only address civil rights for racial minorities, but also for women. We get the Supreme Court case that gets rid of, or that makes the Burger Court that we get Brown versus Board, that we get Roe versus Wade in 1973. That's a Republican Supreme Court justice, and the decision is written by Harry Blackmun, I believe, who's also Republican. And so we have this entire jurisprudence now coming from 54 through about 1983 that uses the 14th Amendment to protect individual minority rights in this country and to regulate business, which is really what is under the burr under the saddle of most of the people in the Federalist Society. And since about, I don't remember what year Bork was he 81 or 80, you don't care, 81 or 83, somewhere in there. The reason Bork was so important is because Bork was an originalist. And originalism has gone through 4 phases, but he was saying, you can't do that. You can't use the 14th Amendment that way. We need to go back to jurisprudence before that. And if we do that, there goes all of that legislation, except Brown. They always make the exception for Brown in their hearings, and it's like, you can't throw out the argument behind all these other cases and keep Brown. And nobody seems to be talking about why they say they can keep Brown. So it's different in this moment in that the Supreme Court and what it can do is erase the gains that civil rights have made since 1954. And even when the Fuller Court was messing around saying that, separate but equal and railroad, that's actually a railroad case. Railroads can do whatever they want. Or Pollock v. Farmers Loan, that the government's not strong enough to tax anybody, which was, oh, come on. But it is strong enough to hunt down Gene Debs. There just wasn't that much to destroy. And now there's so much to destroy that that I am more concerned about the Supreme Court than most people are, because I look at the bigger picture. And I'm if you read me, you know that I was beside myself over SB 8 out of Texas, not on the grounds of abortion, although that itself was an issue, but on the grounds of, if you take a right, which it is a constitutional right, what can't you take away? And if you can take it away by vigilantes, which is what that law sets up, doesn't that sound an awful lot like the KKK? So I think we're in trouble with the Supreme Court. I do think it's going to be interesting if anybody actually looks into the 95% of the documents about Brett Kavanaugh that we didn't see. So people are talking about packing the court and adding more seats, which I think we should, just because it hasn't grown in so long. We're in a place where our democracy, our people no longer fit our mechanics. Not just the Supreme Court. We've gotten I can't do the math, 4 more districts than we had. The last time we expanded the Supreme Court was under Grant in 1869. It's high time. But I wonder if, rather than expanding the court, we need to be thinking about shrinking it. Well, I think if we found there was something that was untoward, we do have such a thing as impeachment. And I always thought that was, I just say that when I look at history, because I've done it a while now, it's like looking at the cement that comes out of the back of a cement truck, and it's all gray, and there's a rock, and it goes flowing, and you just watch it go by. And then every once in a while, there's a kid's plastic truck or a carp jumping, and those things stand out. You get pissed off about stuff. It's like, it's kind of run of the mill. It's not a big story. Kavanaugh was a big story. That was a kid's dump truck, and I just feel like we haven't quite gotten to the bottom of that one yet.